Hey everyone, welcome to my new tutorial series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Masters. I'm a senior animator currently working at People Can Fly, and I've had the privilege of working on games like Elder Scrolls Online, Spyro Reignited Trilogy, as well as Dauntless. And on all three of those games, I did a lot of creature animation. So in this tutorial series, I want to go over the process of creating a creature run cycle, more importantly, a dinosaur run cycle inside of Maya. So we're going to be going over that entire process, and I'm going to be using the IRex dinosaur rig. This is a free rig you can download online, so I'll make sure to link it in the description below so you can grab it yourself. So I want to make sure that in this tutorial series, I'm really explaining and showing my entire process. There might be a few areas that are time-lapsed if it's getting into just really minute pose details and changes and that kind of thing, but I really want to make sure that I'm explaining everything I do, just so that if you want to, you can very easily follow along. And I'll also be expanding this tutorial series to sort of cover more of an animation set that you would create for a video game. So we're creating a run cycle, but typically once you have your run cycle, you'll need to build all of the gameplay elements that go into that run cycle. So for example, a start and stop animation. So going from the run cycle into the idle animation, or going from the idle animation into the run cycle. So we're also going to be building that in this series as well, going over that process, showing how I use animation layers to quickly build the other sets for this run cycle. So with that out of the way, we're going to just go ahead and jump into Maya and begin blocking the run cycle. So we're inside of Maya here, and I want to go over just a few things that I have set up just to make sure that we're working at the same settings if this is something you want to follow along with, or if you just want to learn some of my settings that I use when I'm animating. So first things first, I always want to make sure I have auto key turned on, that little icon down here at the right. That way I don't have to constantly press S anytime I make a change to a control. Also have my frames per second set to 30, and that's typically what you would have it set if you're working in games. And since we're going to approach this as if it were a game animation, we want to make sure that we have it set to 30 frames per second. Also, I'm using Animate, and I probably will be using Animate throughout this tutorial series. It makes the process a whole lot faster. So if you haven't downloaded Animate, or if you haven't tried it, I highly recommend getting the 30-day free trial. It gives you so many tools in here that's really going to speed up the process. And also in this scene, I have a few lights set up. This is really what I throw into every scene that I animate. I have this sphere and the floor plane in the background. I like having the sort of grid around me just so that I'm not sort of just in a blank 3D space. I kind of have a floor and I kind of have a background that I can use almost as a reference point as I'm animating to kind of get a better understanding of my perspective as well. And my UI in Maya is pretty much default. I took out the help as well as the sort of script editor down here at the bottom, just because I don't really need that. So I went ahead and just went up here to Windows, UI Elements, hid the command line and hid the help line. And we can always show that again if we need them. With that, let's go ahead and get started here. What I'm first going to do is go up here to the geometry selection tab, just deselect that just so I don't accidentally select any geometry in my scene. And I'm going to select all of my control curves on this character rig. I'm going to go down here to the quick select set on the Animate menu here. Again, we're going to be using Animate quite a bit for this. I'm just going to type in all there just so that I basically have a selection set that selects all of my control curves. And with those selected, before I actually add a keyframe, I'm going to change my timeline down here to start at frame 0. And then what I'm going to do for this is go to frame 26. So I'm going to type in frame 26. We can always adjust the frame length as we're animating, as we're tweaking our timing. But for this, I'm thinking this will probably be around a 26 frame run cycle. So we'll go ahead and start with that. We're going to start at frame 0 for our first sort of contact position. And then we'll have that exact same contact position at frame 26. So now on frame 0, I'm just going to press S on my keyboard just to lock a keyframe down. So you can see we have it in our timeline there. And now I'm going to begin adjusting our first contact pose. Now, if you watched my workflow video, you might have seen that sometimes I like to work with a cube. And I do that quite often, especially when I'm working with a really complex animation where the character is moving around a lot. I really start with just blocking in a cube and using that as my base for the animation and sort of constraining the cog to that cube. However, when it comes to walk cycles and run cycles, I do find it easier to just start on the character rig, start with the base sort of contact pose, and I build all the information that I need off of that single contact pose. So that's what we're going to be doing here. We're going to start by creating a contact pose for this run cycle. So I'm going to start by selecting the cog control here, or this root basically controlling the entire character rig. And you will notice that It is a bit sluggish here, manipulating this character rig. It is a pretty dense rig, so that's something you'll have to work through. You could try pressing 5 on your keyboard, take off some of the textures, but that really doesn't speed it up. I'll go ahead and press 6 to bring those back here. But I'm just gonna begin adjusting the translate Y for this. And I'm actually gonna bring it up just a little bit to maybe around a value of 8 or 9 or so on the translate Y here. Translate Z, I'm actually gonna bring him back just a little bit, maybe to around a value of -10 or so on that. And if we want to, we could sort of just round this off by just going -10 on some of these values. I might want to actually bring this up just a little bit more on the translate Y, so I might actually try a value of 10 on that as well. Just brought it up just very slightly. And we can tweak the rotate X just a little bit. I might bring it up just very slightly, maybe to around a value of -1 on that. When we're sort of just building a rough pose for this, what I want to do now is start tweaking my foot control. So I'm going to bring this foot control back, bring it up. This will be the foot that is in the air. The right foot will be the actual contacting foot for this pose. And I'll probably bring it up even more and begin to rotate along the X. Bring it pretty far back there. Again, we can always tweak this pose as we continue working. On the translate Z, I might bring it back just a little bit more. Maybe we'll just try a value of -200 in there. I might want to bring it up as well, just a little bit more. Just something like that. And we can begin rotating the foot along the Y axis as well, and along the Z. And I might actually translate it in just a little bit. All right, let's go ahead and grab the front foot. We'll bring it forward. Maybe not quite that far. We might bring it to maybe around a value of 125 along the translate Z. Maybe bring it in along the X just a little bit. Maybe bring it in just slightly, and then maybe just rotate it just a little bit. All right, so now that we have the leg and the cog control sort of posed out roughly where we want them, I'm gonna go ahead and grab the chest control here, and I'm gonna begin rotating this just slightly to get a little bit more of a curve in that spine. We want to make sure that he feels like engaged, like he's sort of running at something. So we're going to have him sort of hunched over just a little bit. Make sure it feels almost as if it were an in-combat run cycle. So when you're working in games, oftentimes you'll have different types of run cycles depending on the situation in the game. So if this was a character you were actually fighting against, if it was directly in combat with you, the run cycle would be its combat run cycle. So it would feel more aggressive, more engaged. Whereas if it was just a run cycle it was doing sort of just in the world, it wasn't really attacking you or anything like that, that would probably be a different run cycle and it would just feel a little bit more relaxed. So this is a run cycle we want to make sure feels a bit more aggressive, like it's intentionally running at a target. So I'm going to go ahead, begin rotating the chest down a bit, and we can add a little bit of tilt in there. And actually the rotation values on the chest is something that oftentimes I'll begin to tweak once I actually see the rest of the animation in motion. So a lot of these poses I'll go back to and adjust as I'm starting to layer in more of the detail on the animation itself. And once I actually start figuring out the timing and the spacing that I want, I let that allow me to tweak my poses. I don't like being stuck with a pose as soon as I start. This is really, I think of just a rough pose process. I'm just getting a quick pose in there that I can begin to actually build my animation on top of, and then I let that animation that I build start to actually dictate some of my posing. So at this point in the animation process, I'm not really worried about the tail just yet. I usually approach the tail a little bit later in my animation once I actually start getting some movement in here. So for the arms, I'm just gonna begin rotating them roughly into place. I wanna have them sort of tucked up here, bring the elbow in, and have sort of a like creepy kind of pose on the arms, almost as if he's ready to grab you or sort of like ready to actually reach out. So I'm gonna bring the elbow in here. And for the fingers, we wanna get better pose on these fingers. So I'm gonna go in here and just begin quickly posing them out. Now you'll notice on this finger control, the skinning is a little bit broken. That's one thing slightly wrong with this rig, but it's really not that noticeable. So I'm not really gonna worry about it. I'm just gonna pose around it basically. So just quickly getting a more interesting finger pose here for the right hand. Again, it really doesn't need to be perfect at this point. We just wanna get something in there pretty roughly, just a little bit more interesting than having the default finger pose on those. Something like that. Maybe I'll bring this elbow down slightly. Have one hand slightly lower than the other. Probably bring it in as well. Grab the clavicle. Bring both of the arms tucked under the character just a little bit more. Something like that. And for the head, I might actually just translate it down slightly. And the neck and the head is something I'll probably tweak a little bit later on once I actually start seeing the movement in here. So the next thing that I want to change here is the actual hip control here. So I'm going to start rotating this direction slightly, as the right foot is the one forward here. So I'm going to rotate that along the Y, maybe around a value of 11 or 12 or so. On the rotate Z, I'll translate it down, maybe around a value of 5 on the translate Z. And then rotate X, I'm just going to translate it back. Not too far, maybe around a value of like -4 or so, just to kind of continue this nice arc that we're getting along the back toward the tail section here. So with this pose, I know that since this foot is leading, the next pose on this animation will probably be more of the down pose. So I have it rotated down along the Z, but once the character really puts all their weight on this foot, the hips are actually going to shift that way as that foot takes the weight. So I know after this pose, I'll need to think about how I want to actually animate those hips, how they're going to need to shift around in order to really feel like they're taking that weight. So we have our really rough pose in here for this sort of like contact pose. Again, I'm not worried about the tail just yet. What I'm going to do is select the all selection set. If you don't have a selection set, you can very easily just select everything like that. But I'm going to go ahead and go down to frame 26, press S, just so that I know the pose on frame 0 and the pose on frame 26 are the same pose. So now that we have those two poses matched, what we need to do now is create the opposite step for this. So since this is a cycle, basically in the middle of this cycle would be the opposite step. So the left foot would be the one planting, the right foot would be the one actually in the air. So again, I'm going to do this with Animate. Now what we need to do is go over here to the mirror tool, and I'm going to choose mirror all keys. Now if there's an option to actually just mirror an individual pose, I don't know how to do that. So if you guys know how to do that, please leave it in the comment below. But for this, I'm just going to mirror all the keys, which basically mirrors the entire animation. Then I'm going to go to the keyframe on frame 0. I'm going to hit the copy pose tool here to copy that pose. And then I'm just going to undo before I made that mirror animation. And then I'm just going to paste that pose that I copied onto frame 13. So now if we flip through here, you can see we have the exact same pose mirrored and flipped for us. So now if we play this, you can see we're getting obviously a very, very rough animation in here. Doesn't look great, but really we're just working with two single poses, and Maya is just blending between this pose, and then back to the first pose on frame 26. So at this stage of the animation, really the first thing that I want to figure out is the timing, the feel, the weight, how the character is actually going to be basically bobbing up and down for each one of these steps, how I want that to feel. Do I want it to quickly drop down in the down position, or do I want it to more quickly pop up sort of in the up and the passing position? So that's something we need to figure out. And this is when I really start to actually go in here and start animating. Once I start figuring out the main motion of this run cycle, then again, that will help me sort of understand the poses that I need to sort of achieve what I visualize in my head as I'm working on this main cog control. So what I'm going to do here is open up the graph editor, and I'm going to snap it down here at the bottom. We don't have a ton of room to work with, but I want to make sure you can see what I'm doing inside the graph editor, as well as see the scene up here at the top. So really all I'm worried about here, and really all I want to focus on at this point, is the up and down of the hips on the cog control. So what I'm going to do is scrub forward here to frame 3, and I'm going to press S on my keyboard. And if you want to, at this early stage, it's actually a good idea to just lock a keyframe down on all of your controls, just to make things really simple here, just so you know there's a keyframe on everything at frame 3. So at this position, I'm going to grab this and bring it down. Again, this is on frame 3, the down position. We want this down position to be pretty quick as it takes its weight on that right foot. So I'm actually going to bring this pretty far down. Again, we can always tweak it later, but I'm going to go to around a value of -30. So again, it's really dropping down there. And it will look like quite a bit when we're just working with the up and down and the cog. But again, we're going to be layering on more and more detail. We're going to start layering on the chest and the hip animation. So we'll get some offset with the chest as well as the head. So this down will feel really nice as it takes the weight there. And then I'm actually gonna go forward to maybe around frame 10, and I'll press the all selection set. I'll press S, my keyboard, to lock a keyframe down, go to that translate Y, and I'm gonna bring the hips up. And this is actually gonna go past the contact position that we have on frame 0. And I'll bring it maybe to around a value of 25 or so. So basically what we want is that's going to be more of our up position right there. So that's the point where the IRex will have probably both feet off the ground. It will be the highest position, and then it'll drop down here and then follow through into that whole down position. So you can kind of start to see what we're creating here. So on frame 13 is where we have that opposite contact position here. So I'm going to scrub forward 3 frames, press the all selection set, we'll press S to lock a keyframe down, and I'm going to bring this down. And this is where we need to make sure that this down position and this down position match as far as the value, because this is really just the down position on the opposite foot. So I'm going to go ahead and select this keyframe here on frame 3. I'm going to select that value in the graph editor. I'm going to press Ctrl C to copy that, paste it here, Ctrl V. All right. And then what I'm going to do is scrub forward to frame 23, press Alt, press S to lock a keyframe down. Same process, we're going to drag this up, and this is where we want to copy this keyframe value at frame 10. So we'll copy that value, we'll paste it over here on frame 23, and then at frame 26, that value will match with frame 13 as well as frame 0. Now, one thing that I want to make sure that we do before we move on any further is make sure we have this cycling in our graph editor. Obviously, we're making a cycle, so we need to actually visualize it here in the graph editor. So I'm going to go ahead and press all on my selection set there, and I'm going to go ahead and do curves, pre-infinity, cycle, post-infinity, cycle. And if you don't see that popping up in your graph editor, make sure under view, you have it set to infinity so you can actually see that. So now if we select the cog control, we can see the hiccup that we're going to get. These keyframes don't really match up. You can see basically both of them are slowing in and slowing out. So we're getting this hump here in the graph so that we know when we cycle, basically as it's coming down, it's actually slowing down again, and then speeding up based on that tangent handle. So that's not really what we want. So we need to begin to adjust these tangent handles, make sure this is a nice smooth transition. Bring this tangent handle up a little bit. Bring this down, and actually what I'm going to do on the keyframe on frame 3, the keyframe on frame 16, is I want to make sure that we don't have this sort of ease into that keyframe. So what I'm going to do is select this keyframe, I'm going to break that tangent handle, I'm going to bring this tangent handle up. So you can see it's just a little bit more linear going into that. Same on this one. Bring it up, maybe adjust this tangent handle just slightly. So you can kind of see the shape that we're getting here. Now, what I want to make sure that I do is I want to make sure that as it gets to the top here, there's that nice spacing as it begins to fall down, and then it'll speed up just like if you were to animate a bouncing ball. So we're actually going to create something similar to that with the up and down of the hip here on the IRex. So I'm going to go forward here to frame 7, lock a keyframe down on all of those controls, go back to the translate Y here. And it won't need to be a big change, but I will just bring this up just a little bit. And then same on frame 20. Bring it up just slightly. So basically what we're trying to create here is that as it drops down in the down position, it moves pretty quick there. And then as it pops back up, there's just that slow into that up as it gets to the top of the arc. So we can play this, and it might look just a little bit weird. Obviously, it's just the hips moving up and down, but we're really just allowing this animation to take shape. Now, obviously, the feet are just moving back and forth. That looks really weird. The tail is just translating and rotating back and forth, following what the hips are doing. So it's looking really rough at this point. But at this point, as I look at this, I can start to visualize the weight, the up and down of this character. We can always tweak some of these tangent handles and the positions on the Translate Y keyframes if we wanted it to drop lower, or maybe not drop that far down on the down position. We can always tweak these keyframes pretty quickly and adjusting our tangent handles here. But this is how I like to really build my run cycles and my walk cycles here, is that once I start to see the up and down of the hips, then it will allow me to really see the rest of the animation as I begin to build it. Looking at this, I know that as the hips drop down, there will probably be some rotation along the X, almost dragging a little bit. So we'll be getting that in there. But this is really a strong building block for us. We just started with this single pose. We mirrored that pose for the opposite foot, and then we began animating the cog control to figure out the up and down motion. And now we're going to be slowly layering on more and more detail to really flesh out this run cycle. So now we're going to begin animating some rotation on the character's cog control. And one thing that's important to mention is that if this is your first time really working with a layered approach to creating your animations instead of more of a pose-to-pose approach, you do have to sort of have a bit more trust in yourself and just really a trust overall in the process. Because when you're doing a layered approach, like if we play this animation again, obviously this animation doesn't look good. So you're looking at this and it can be a little bit concerning or just frustrating when you look at your animation. It's not really looking how you imagine. But that's really just the nature of a layered approach. You're just slowly adding on more and more detail to your animation. So quite often at the early stages of the animation, your animation just simply isn't going to look that good until later on once you actually start tying things down. Once we start animating the chest and the mid controls, as well as the neck and the head, and actually get the feet animated properly. So it's kind of one of the things you need to get comfortable with and sort of just trust the overall process. So with that, let's go ahead and begin animating the rotation along the x-axis here. And we can go into our graph editor for this. I'll go ahead and just highlight rotate x. And what I'm going to do is go to frame 7. And I'm going to begin rotating along the x-axis here. And what we can do is go ahead and adjust this value up here so that we can do basically more micro adjustments on the rotation x. So now if we just click with middle mouse and drag in the viewport, we're able to get a smaller adjustment. And we're going to bring this down. We can just scrub forward here and kind of see how this is looking. This might be a little bit too much, but we'll go ahead and just keep it at around a value of 6 for this. And then we can go ahead and go to frame 3. And for this, we don't really need a key on there just yet. So we'll go ahead and just select that. And I'm just going to press the delete key to delete that. So you can see we're starting to get some rotation along the x-axis. And then we're going to scrub forward to around frame 13. And this is when the dinosaur is starting to drop. You can see on the hips are coming down. So what we actually want to do for this section is actually have the rotation begin to rotate up. So in this direction, as the hips actually drop downwards. We'll go ahead and just grab the key there and just bring it down a little bit. And we really don't want it to be too much. You can see there's quite a bit of rotation whipping up. So we're actually going to bring that up quite a bit. And on frame 10, I might actually go ahead and just delete this key. We can start really tweaking the keys and adding more keys when we're working on the spacing of this. But right now, I kind of just want to get something pretty simple in there. And we might drag this up just a little bit. And actually, since frame 13 and frame 0 are basically the same pose, it's just the opposite leg, what we could actually do to simplify this is just take this value of -1 and paste it here. And we can always tweak the value for these main key poses there. But for right now, I think this will work. So we just need to basically just do this for the opposite step here. So for this, I'm going to just go to frame 20. We can copy this value on frame 7. Of 6, and then just paste it here on frame 20. And then we can go ahead and just delete these keys here and delete this keyframe there. So now you can see sort of the basic rotation that we're getting. So again, even just adding a bit of rotation along the x-axis just for the entire cog control, it's starting to look a little bit better. There's a little bit more movement happening on this run. Now, once we start getting the chest involved, start getting the chest kind of offsetting some of this rotation, we're gonna get a really nice fleshy feeling to this run. And for this, I wanna make sure we actually have the infinity turned on, make sure we're viewing that. So it looks like we need to go over here to pre-infinity, cycle, post-infinity, cycle, just so we can see that cycle happening here for this. So now that we have some rotation along the cog control, what we're going to do is add a bit of rotation to this chest control. And there's actually a pretty cool trick we can use for quickly getting some rotation for the chest. And I'll show you how we can set that up. So oftentimes when I'm animating something like a cycle, I'll actually see what curves and what keyframes I can actually reuse and repurpose for a separate part of the body. And in this case, we want to have some rotation along the X for the chest. So what we can do to actually speed this up is go ahead and select our cog control, go down here to rotate X, and I'm just going to select all of these keyframes here. And I'm just going to hit copy. So I copied all of the X rotation keyframes. I'm going to go over here to the chest. And what we can go ahead and do is just delete all these keyframes for now. And then what I want to make sure that I remember is this value of 6.25. So that's going to be reset once we actually paste the value of the copy rotation X along the cog control. So we'll go ahead and select that keyframe there, and I'll just go to paste here in the graph editor. And that's going to paste all of that, but you can see we're utilizing the value that was on the cog control. So you can see the chest kind of snaps up since it's set to a value of -1. I'll go ahead and just drag this up until we get back to around a value of 6.2 there for the chest. So now we're getting that similar rotation. Now you'll notice that when we do this, we're getting some rotation along the X, but currently it's basically just copying the exact rotation that we had. But what we can try here is actually flipping this rotation so that it's basically a mirrored version of the cog control. And you'll see we'll get some really nice offset in this animation. Now I actually have a shelf button for this, and I'll make sure in the description of the video, I put the script for this very simple flip command. So once we have this, all we need to do is just hit flip. And that's going to flip the rotation here on these keyframes. So now you can see as we go to frame 7, basically the rotation on the chest control is sort of flipped and mirrored what's happening on the cog control. So we're starting to get some nice offset on the chest. What we need to actually do now is bring in some translation. So we want to make sure that this chest feels nice and fleshy. So we're actually going to add some translation to the chest itself. So for this, I'm going to do the exact same thing we did for the rotation. So I'm going to select the cog control. I'm going to go into my translate Y, and I'm just going to go ahead and select all of these keyframes. We're just going to copy them. So we'll go up here to edit, copy, and then we'll go to the chest control, go to translate Y. I'll go ahead and delete all these keyframes. And then on frame 0, we know that all of the translation keys are zeroed out. So once we go ahead and just paste this in here, what we need to do is just make sure that the first keyframe here is at a value of 0. Currently, it's at a value of 10, which we don't want. So we're going to bring it down just a little bit. And it doesn't need to be perfect. We can always adjust this in a minute. We just want to make sure that we're kind of getting it roughly to where it was before we pasted this. And we can zoom in here to get more of a micro adjustment on this. All right, so something like that. And again, this is a mirrored version of the translate Y, basically the up and down on the hips, now happening on the chest. So now we're getting some really sort of like bouncy feeling, which again, this doesn't look great just yet. So what we're going to do is basically flip this like we did for the rotation. So with them all selected, I'm gonna go up here to my shelf, and I'll go ahead and just hit flip. All right, and that basically just flipped that curve. And some of these tangent handles we don't need. You can see we have this like straight tangent here going into the keyframe on frame 3. I'm gonna go ahead and select this and just hit the auto tangent to basically bring that flattened out again here as well. And then now we can go ahead and play this. And now you can see by just simply taking the values from the cog control on the translate Y and the rotate X and basically copying those values and then flipping those values on the chest, we're starting to get something that feels a bit more fleshy. You can see we're getting some really nice fleshiness in the chest. And of course, as we continue to animate this and as we continue to bring in more movement on this middle chest control here, as we get some more rotation along this chest control, we're just beginning to flesh this out. And already you can see that the animation is starting to come together. Where we were just a few minutes ago with just the cog control animated, it looked pretty goofy. It really didn't look like we had a solid animation in there. And that's where you really need to just sort of trust the process, that you understand that you'll eventually get to the place that you need to be as you begin to slowly layer on more and more detail to your animation, basically one control at a time. And now what we can do on this chest is let's add a little bit more rotation on the Y and the Z. Now you'll notice that we actually have a little bit of animation happening here across these values just because we had a little bit of change between those main key contact poses. So if we go into something like the rotate Y here, you can see we have some keyframes here and some basic animation, but we're gonna change this up just a little bit. So for this, just to simplify it, I'm gonna delete the 3 keyframes here and the 3 keyframes here. So we basically just have this keyframe at frame 13 here. And now I'm going to select the 2 keyframes here at frame 0 and frame 26, the main contact poses there. And I might tweak these just a little bit to kind of straighten the chest out a little bit on these actual contact poses. And we'll bring this down just a little bit. Again, kind of just straightening out just a little bit more. Around a value of -0.5 or so should be fine. And then what we're gonna do is scrub forward here to frame 13. And what we're going to do is copy this value here, paste it on the keyframe on frame 13, take away that negative value in the graph editor there. Because again, the pose on frame 13 is basically the mirrored version of frame 0 there. So we're getting just a little bit of rotation along the y-axis, which is working well. Again, you can see we're getting some nice fleshiness in the chest there. That looks good. Let's go ahead and go to rotate Z. And for the rotate Z, I'm going to do something a little bit different. It's not going to be as simple as the rotate Y. What we'll go ahead and do is kind of just start from scratch here. I'll go ahead and just delete all of the middle keyframes there. And then I'm going to select both of the keyframes there in the graph editor, and I'm going to drag them up just slightly. Kind of straighten it out a little bit on that first contact pose. All right, something like that should work just fine. And we want to animate this rotate Z based on the sort of up and down of the hips. So as the body comes down here, I'm going to scrub forward a bit, and right around frame 5, we'll just go ahead and select the curve there. We'll right click and choose insert keyframe, and I'm going to drag this down a bit. We're actually going to rotate this Z control a bit like that, so there's some nice tilt in it. And we'll bring it to maybe just around a value of -1. So as the hips drop and the weight is put on these hips here, we want to make sure that the rotation along the Z sort of matches that. So we're getting just a bit more rotation like that. And then it will begin to kind of straighten out as the hips raise up. And then what we can do is just scrub forward. And since frame 13 is basically the mirrored version, the mirrored pose of the pose on frame 0, and since we went forward 5 frames and rotated the control at around a value of -1, what we want to do is basically do the opposite for the other leg. So as we scrub forward here, we want to go 5 frames forward. So starting at frame 13, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're on frame 18. I'll just right click and choose insert keyframe, and we'll bring this up, and we can go ahead and just copy this value here of -1.021. We'll paste that here, take away the negative sign since this is the opposite leg. So we're kind of getting that opposite rotation happening there. And then obviously you can see we need to fix the tangent handle. This is the benefit of really showing your infinity curves, making sure you're having a nice smooth transition, because if we have flat tangent handles, that means the hips are going to slow into that and then slow out, which is not what we want there. So what we'll do is drag this tangent handle up, drag this one down till we get a nice smooth transition there into something a bit more like this. And now we can play it, and you can start to see we're getting just a little bit of rotation along the Z-axis. It's pretty subtle, but we don't want to go too crazy with it. And you can already see by just beginning to animate just the chest control. So basically all we have animated right now is the cog control and the chest control. With some detail added to both of those controls, you can start to see we're beginning to flesh out this animation. Now the feet aren't really even animated. They're basically just going from this contact pose to this contact pose and then back to the original. So we're just having the feet slide back and forth. So once we actually really tie down the feet, this animation will really begin to come together. And then as we slowly add more and more detail to things like the arms and the neck and the head, we'll get closer to finishing this off. But again, it's sort of just one of those things where you need to trust the process. And at that early stage, the animation will look really, really rough, but sort of just trusting that process and just knowing that as you slowly add more and more detail to each control and really begin to flesh out this animation, it will all come together at the end. So that's going to wrap it up for this part. In the next part, we're going to begin animating the actual hip control, as well as start animating the feet. Make sure we actually have the feet animated properly in the way we want. So that's what we're going to do in the next video. Now, if you have any comments or suggestions or questions on this animation, be sure to leave them in the comments below. And thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next part.